Hi, I'm Greeshma Kuthar, and you're listening to episode 8 of Mission Manipur, a frontline podcast that looks in detail at the Manipur conflict. This episode is titled Refugee. Reporting in Manipur hasn't been difficult just because of the lack of interest for most Indians in the region or the lack of political will from the central government to address the violence in the state, or the massive disinformation that the state government put out on its own volition to distort what happened in Manipur. It has been exceptionally difficult because for the first time in my life, I saw state propaganda fueling hate against a community by labeling them as refugee. Now, how do you report on that? I mean, you can surely ask me the question, how can Indians be called refugee in their own country? But they were. They still are. Elected legislators, journalists, writers, musicians, students, almost anybody prominent from the Kuki-Zo community in Manipur who would comment on the violence in Manipur has probably been called refugee. You can get on Twitter and just follow any thread on the Manipur violence. You will find this word casually dropped like it's a bad word. The reality is, much before the violence started on May 3rd of 2023, a vicious, inflammatory language started circulating in Manipur, targeting refugees fleeing the war in Myanmar. To rewind, the military junta took over the administration of Myanmar in 2021, after which the country saw many rebel groups take on the junta. As the fighting intensified in Myanmar, Burmese citizens from the border villages had no choice but to flee the country towards the borders of India. Now, the alternative is to be tortured or to die in the airstrikes that the military government in Myanmar used against the rebel groups and the regions that rebel groups controlled. While refugees were initially provided sanctuary in Mizoram, in Manipur there was actually a mixed reaction. In 2021, refugees were given space in the border villages of Tengnopal, which is the villages beyond Moreh, but the Manipur government started arresting some of them in early 2023, and this immediately created panic. This is around the time when the ethnic violence also started in Manipur. After this language of illegal immigrants and anti-refugee sentiment peaked in the state. But at the same time, fighting was also intensifying in Myanmar. When the violence hit an all-time high in the Sagaing region in late 2023, more Burmese citizens fled to another district in Manipur called Kamjang. What the district administration immediately did is they collected the biometric information of most of these refugees and housed them along the border in makeshift camps. Everything was pretty much going smoothly, which is this process was being followed every time anybody new would come and they would be allotted like space within these camps until people in Manipur once again started making absolutely careless statements about these refugees, calling them illegal immigrants. Now, whenever illegal immigrant is used in Manipur, it almost completely means that the target of that kind of language is the Kuki-Zo community. And this flare up of this language happened right in the middle of the violence in Manipur. Once again, to set context, I mean, this is very important that we understand it. Illegal immigrant, the term itself, is used only with reference to Kuki-Zo people right now in Manipur. And the person who was leading from the front to use this term is the former Chief Minister, Biren Singh. Like I said before, after May 3rd of 2023, this term has become almost a slur, with all Kuki-Zo being referred to as illegal immigrants from Myanmar. Now, organizations such as the Arambai Tengol started using the term provocatively, and they did this even before the violence started in Manipur. 2024 started in Manipur with Biren Singh proudly declaring that he had successfully started deporting refugees who had fled the war in Myanmar. Basically, Biren Singh was sending people back to a hostile government that, in all probability, was going to cause harm to these refugees who were seen as being critical of their government. What we need to remember here is this is when violence was at a peak in Manipur, and not only were people killing each other, the Arambai Tengol were actually walking around armed, administering oaths to elected representatives, beating them up if they disagreed with what they said, and also live streaming full blown violence. So, this is happening in Manipur, and airstrikes are also killing Burmese citizens, and they are fleeing towards India. And this is also when Biren Singh is posturing as somebody who is wiping out, in quotes, illegal immigrants, who he had himself declared were grabbing land and changing the demography of Manipur and whatnot. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff that he alleged that these refugees were doing. So while all of this was happening in 2024, and people were fleeing from the Sagaing region to Kamjong, Biren Singh by now was being called out for his xenophobic behavior. This is the behavior that was very visible, and this is the behavior that was being used by him to pit the Meitei against the Kuki-Zo. What he does now is there's another tweet that he puts out in May of 2024, and this is what the tweet said. Open quotes. The government has detected a total of 5,457 illegal immigrants in Kamjong district, Manipur, as on May 7th. Out of the total, the biometric data of 5,173 such illegal immigrants have been collected. Deportation process is underway. We have been giving humanitarian aid to all the illegal immigrants who are detected so far. Despite being an alarming situation, we have been handling it with utmost sensitivity. Close quotes. Now, he tweeted this in May, but like I already mentioned, the refugees had started coming into Kamjong, into the border of Kamjong and Burma, from the end of 2023. So it is almost after 5 months that he randomly picks this up and he tweets, like as if all these 5,000 people just landed up one day before he tweeted. Now, what was the purpose of such a tweet? Obviously, what it led to is a flood of misinformation about who these refugees in Kamjong are. Like I already said, the minute you say illegal immigrant, it is equated to Kuki-Zo. So messages then immediately after this tweet started getting circulated in social media sites that all of these refugees are Kuki-Zo. But in reality, only half of them are Kuki-Zo, while the rest are Myanmar Buddhist. Many people in Imphal, decided to basically started questioning why Kuki-Chin illegal immigrants were being housed and fed in Manipur when the valley was in direct conflict with the Kuki-Zo and the hills. How can we let this happen? These were the kind of questions that they were posing in social media. Now, to kind of give ourselves a sense of reality, I have visited the refugee camps and shelters both in Tengnupal and Kamjong. The refugee families that live in these settlements, they are usually allotted very small shacks. Like you can't walk in that shack. You can maybe like 4 people can sleep in one of these shacks. That's the size of it. And all these shacks are clubbed together. And all these camps are really cramped. So some of these camps are accessible through, what you would call a motorable road, but most of the others aren't. Like, especially if it's raining, you can't get to these camps, which means they don't get essentials or they don't get medical care whenever needed. The refugee settlements in the villages beyond More and Tengnupal are in actually a far worse state than those in Kamjong because they don't even have access to basics. So, what we need to understand is not only has hatred been created against these Burmese refugees in Manipur by conflating their identity with the Kuki-Zo, but fear has also been fueled in them that they can any minute be handed over back to the junta from whose bombs and from whose soldiers they fled. So, all of this brings us to a very important question. How did or how do politicians in India use citizens of another country, in this case a war torn country, to fuel hatred in India? I personally do believe that there are barely any mainstream conversations about what the refugee policy is in India. And why is it that, particularly in the Northeast, the conversation around refugees is so difficult, if not complicated? So, to make it simpler, not just for me, but for all those who are interested in this conversation, I have invited two experts to speak to me. One is Manoranjan Pegu, who is a trade union activist and a writer from Assam, who also focuses on cultural nationalism. But I would call him more of a historian, considering a large chunk of his writing has been to contrast the majoritarian identity that has emerged in Assam with the reality of many other tribes that make up that state. Joining me and Mano in this conversation is also Angshuman Choudhury, who is again a scholar on the Northeast, yes, but has also been writing on the refugee question in the Northeast, and more particularly, somebody who understands what's happening in Myanmar the best. Thank you, both Mano and Angshuman, for speaking to me today and to also agreeing to speak on this podcast. The context of this episode is refugees, and from the time that I've been reporting from Manipur, the first thing that I, in fact, sort of understood after I came to Manipur and I started reporting from here is there's a lot of narrative that's been constructed around refugee, right? And be it in the language of politicians, be it in the language of the chief minister himself, there was this whole illegal immigrant kind of language that had become very common by then. Like some of the first few posters that I saw when I was in Imphal, in fact, was illegal immigrants leave Manipur, those kind of things. Right from then, I have tried to do a little bit of reporting on refugees through the last, it's going to be 2 years. So in the last 2 years, I've tried to report on refugees from Kamjong and Tengnopal, which is predominantly where refugees are staying on the borders of these two districts. But one thing that has been clear from the way that we look at the violence in Manipur is that there is the narrative around refugee has predominantly been what the Manipur state government has used to construct a certain form of nationalism. And that was very clear from 2022, 2021 itself. Right from the time that the violence started in Myanmar, and from since then, since even before, but with a little more speed after that. So that's the thing about Manipur. And though this podcast is about Manipur, there is certain perspective I think that we need to set from the context of how we've spoken about refugees in the Northeast, which is why my first question is to you, Manu. Can you please give us some historical perspective about how it is that a similar kind of a situation has been there in Assam before, and how a similar kind of language and tone has been used against people, from present day Bangladesh, and how that sort of played out in the past few decades?
Yeah. I think before going into the history, thank you, Greeshma. Before going into the history, it's also probably very important for us to understand that what borders essentially means, right? I think essentially borders are what people would want you to believe is just sacrosanct. It's something which is very, very, that it cannot be changed. But borders, as far as clear understanding goes, it's a social construction. It's a result of a power, a game of power, right? A game of power where basically the borders can appear, reappear, and it can also alter. So it keeps changing, right? So these are not basically something that are drawn with consultation with people, or with consultation with the people who have had historical relationships with each other, right? So essentially, This is not something that is very, very sacrosanct. That's the first thing. And I think there is also a very limited understanding of what refugee essentially means. Like it basically, at least in social parlance and in common understanding parlance, that's what is weaponized, right? Because when you are a refugee, you are trying to escape a situation where you cannot be protected anymore. You are trying to have move to a place where you can hope to get protection. You can hope to get. So there are like conventions which define that. But I mean, the question is like how it is being weaponized. Like, and I also want to bring back to you like how the state kind of reacts. Like the state is essentially reacting to what the society feels or what the common people would understand and weaponize already, because it's reacting to it for electoral purposes, for voting politics, or many other reasons, right? In Assam, obviously, because Northeast as such, because it has, as a region, it has so many international borders, and it is formed by waves of migrations. And migration is the reality in human life. People move from one place to another and continuously form an assimilated society, right? So in Assam, obviously, there was what the society started reacting is coupled with the mainstream nationalism, Assamese nationalism, is that there was a fear psychosis created, right? Because and this is very important to, I think, according to me, is to understand is that like, because when you stop reacting or understanding refugee as somebody trying to escape a really, really bad situation where you cannot have a decent life or protection, you start seeing that person as a conscious conspirator, like really coming in to take away your land, to take away your language, to create a minority within that society, right? And that is what has been weaponized in Assam for a very, very long time. Obviously, everybody knows how Assam was formed, and then how the 1971 war happened, and then there was a lot of refugees that Assam had to take in, and then the anxieties even before that because of the British, and then the waves of migration coming in, be it from people from East Bengal, be it people from central parts of India as Adivasis. There has been various waves of migration that happened. So then you had to create a fear psychosis in the society where you actually start saying that your language is threatened, your religion, obviously your religion is also threatened, but your land is threatened, your economic anxieties get heightened, right? Because you feel that there are already very less jobs, we can't take any more. If you even see the articulations now, that is what it happens, that like in Assam, at least they would like to say that there is no other, like we don't care if it is a Muslim or a Hindu, even though if you go into the nuances, it may be completely different, but they would say we just cannot take immigrants anymore, illegal immigrants anymore. So the legality becomes a concept, and legality becomes a point where they start contesting this. And it creates a lot of issues. I mean, we can go into the issues later on, like how do you detect who came by properly? How do you detect are they actually citizens or immigrants, or how do you detect are they actually refugees? Because India has not signed all that. But it becomes more like a weapon, more like a case of like they are coming in to take our jobs away. They are coming in to take our lands away. Then the anxieties get heightened, and you start accumulating that into a language of political assertion and then social assertion, and then they start fighting back. And that has been historically used. I mean, it has a lot of those struggles have become very, very violent in the case of Assam, where you can see a lot of ethnic cleansing that has taken place. So I think it is important to understand that. And then it has been weaponized to a certain extent that CAA is now a reality, where this kind of acts, which is starts defining and classifying refugees on the basis of religion, classifying people who are harmed on the basis of vulnerabilities, no longer on the basis that the state is attacking them, but based on religion. So I think, and this has become a modus operandi almost everywhere, right? So I think it started from Assam. It is now being blamed in Manipur. It is now being tried and tested in other states. And I think, and there are people who are using this linguistic nationalist language of like NRC should be implemented everywhere. So I think we have almost, like Assam as a state have almost given a classic example of how you actually treat refugees and immigrants, and which is not ideal in this situation. So I think I'll stop here, but I can understand. Thanks.
Yeah, with that perspective and with that kind of a background, I want to come to you, Angshuman. And so you've also been writing about about the situation with respect to refugees and how they are spoken about in Manipur. but also in a broader context, you've been kind of studying patterns across the region, right? And I feel like the first thing that I would like people to understand is, where does India stand? Like Mano touched on it, but where does India stand when it comes to refugees? And why has our stand been so problematic? Can you kind of, speak touch a little bit on that? And then maybe just like walk into how that the difference in how different states also treat refugees by contrasting Manipur and Mizoram. Maybe you could kind of go into that.
Firstly, thanks, Greeshma, for having me on this podcast, and thanks, Mono, for your remarks. I think you set up the context very well in that regard. Um, I think, simply speaking, India has a refugee regime that you could call as an informal, decentralized refugee system, um, which is not, there's nothing on paper, and it's left on executive discretion on what to do with particular groups of refugees, which is why we have seen a mix of pro-refugee policies and openly, explicitly anti-refugee positions being taken by different governments, including the successive central governments and state governments. And a lot of it has been politically and geopolitically driven. For example, the reason why Nehru decided to extend formal refugee status to the Tibetans was squarely geopolitical, should be seen in the geopolitical context of that period. The reason why India could not expel Afghan Muslim refugees, which seems counterintuitive to the politics of Hindutva that we see today, is also geopolitical, in the sense of India wanting to maintain some kind of warm relationship with the Afghan political elite or Afghan Muslim society. So there are geopolitical and geostrategic reasons, similar reasons for Tamils in the south. So it has always been politically and geopolitically contingent. This regime of hospitality that India has, this fuzzy, blurred regime of hospitality that India has extended or not extended, depending on the situation. So, and all of it is sort of framed by the fact that India has not ratified the 1951 Refugee Convention or the 1967 Optional Protocol. And one of the reasons that India gives in not ratifying it is that the convention is a Western-centric convention. It came out of the throes of the post-war period, and it catered to Euro-American sensibilities. And the key argument was that developing economies like India do not have the wherewithal to institutionalize a permanent refugee regime because it needed resources for its own people, etc. And an adjacent argument that India regularly makes at international forum, including today, is that why do we need to ratify the refugee convention when we anyway have been harboring asylum seekers whenever they needed India's care? So that precedent India has always tried to extend, regardless of the fact that in reality, many refugee groups have been facing discrimination, including Afghan Muslims, have been facing discrimination, if not worse, like forced deportations, which we have seen in Manipur. And in some cases, undocumented immigrants from Bangladesh. So this non-existence. So I would largely say that even in its absence, India has a refugee regime, but it's informal, it's arbitrary, and of course, both of them mean that it's exceedingly vague, which also means that individual state governments have a full discretion to play with this, to use the latitude that this vagueness gives for its own interest. So this is exactly why we see two extremely different responses to the same refugee issue in Mizoram and in Manipur, right next to each other. And in many ways, Mizoram's humanitarian position is also to do with ethno-political affinities, geopolitical and geostrategic factors that Mizoram has with Chin state. And similarly, Manipur's rejection of the same group of refugees is also to do with Meitei ethno-nationalist politics. So in sum, I would say that this absence of a refugee regime or a formal national refugee law, in my view, in the long term, does more harm than good, because it deprives asylum seekers of legal safeguards, of institutional safeguards, and safeguards against things that we have seen in Manipur, which is arbitrary detentions and forced deportations. So yeah, this is the general sort of landscape of India's refugee regime as I see it today.
Also, like adding to that, I think even though it has largely been seen, I mean, Tamil Nadu has always pretended to be or spoken in favor of having refugees from Elam, from Sri Lanka in Tamil Nadu. But actually, if you look at how political parties have used refugee as a means of opposing, I mean, refugees from Sri Lanka as a means of opposing Delhi's policies. But at the end of the day, the situation of refugees in Tamil Nadu is still horrible. The camps are still bad. So it also kind of, like you said, it's very discretionary, right? Of how each government kind of deals with. I mean, this is something that I think we can go into even in the case of Mizoram, considering things have been slowly shifting even in Mizoram, with the way that they speak about or are responding to refugees. Like recently, there was this anti-refugee sentiment. There were these reports of anti-refugee sentiment in Mizoram as well. But kind of coming back to to one of the most important questions that I have for both of you is that this kind of language, of addressing refugees as illegal immigrant and then kind of extending that to a large community. In the case of Manipur, it is the Kuki-Zo community, and kind of equating everybody from that community as being refugee, illegal immigrant. I mean, it kind of creates this atmosphere in the state where people are equating, like the rhetoric has been that, not the rhetoric, the way of addressing anybody who's Kuki-Zo, from MLAs to journalists, who some of our, like Meiteis, who is a journalist from Churchandpur. A lot of times she's addressed as a refugee, from her to elected legislators from the region who are Kuki-Zo. They are being called as refugees. So this kind of creates this environment, which is not just like, I mean, there are different ways for us to define this kind of ethnic mislabeling, but it also kind of disrupts the fabric of that state itself, right? For instance, like Meitei nationalism has different forms, but now Meitei nationalism predominantly is kind of centered on targeting this community. Or that's how it is in Manipur, at least. That's predominantly what it has come to, where there is an other, and you're speaking to the other as, in this case, a refugee. So that's the question that I want to kind of like, pose to both of you in the context of be it Assam or in the context of other regions in the Northeast. Can you all like, kind of help us understand how there is a political design in this? And what that political design means when there is one, in the case of Manipur, let's say there's just the Meiteis, but in the case of Assam, other than this broad Assamese identity, there are also many smaller communities that have gotten sucked into this, right? Into this, either claiming or rejecting this narrative that has been created. So I don't know whether there has been a rejection of this form of politics of, centering majoritarianism against people who are dubbed as illegal. But what has been largely the response of civil society to, to a political game like this? I think, Mano, you can start first.
Yes, I mean, it's a very broad question, I think. And it's also something that is like, I mean, what we dubbed as progressive civil society or progressive individuals contesting elections, at least in terms of Assam, you will not find them vociferously articulating anything against this, because this is something that is essentially needed for survival. You will be vilified, you will be repressed, or you will have to face state action towards yourself if you talk against it, right? So in terms of response, I think there has not been a very, very clear rejection of that kind of politics. In fact, I think I would say that it has actually gotten worse. Like it has actually gotten more and more support in the sense. And the redefinitions of like, there's also obviously the complications of who comprises an SMEs and who comprises an indigenous, and also differentiating even groups as indigenous and non-indigenous within the same, like for instance, within the same Muslim community, Assamese Muslim community, you will find there's a clear directional, like conscious attempt to define that these are Khilonjia Muslims and these are non-Khilonjia Muslims, right? So like, how do you end up defining a Khilonjia? Like, do you actually, so like, this is completely different from what actually you call in the sense of citizenship, right? While if you look at it from a very administrative parlance, you may see that anybody who has documents to show before 1971 may be considered a citizen, or it may be included. But that is different from the cultural assimilation and cultural acceptance. Like even today, you will not find Assamese large-scale society accepting an Adivasi from who have come probably from central India more than 200 years ago as an Assamese, like as an included Assamese, as in Khilonjia. The same may happen with Marwaris. Like they have been there even before. Like if you look at history books, they have always been there in Northeast and in Assam as traders way before, and they have generations of people, and they will not be included as Khilonjia. So that weaponization always happens, right? So I think this is something that we definitely have to kind of take note of when we're talking about it. So I mean, and it also happens that by such a redefinition, what you end up doing is that you end up weaponizing even the marginalized against the same marginalized, right? You will find as soon as you start dividing communities as a base of like you are an indigenous and they are an outsider, they don't fit into it. So you have to, and I have written about it, right? Where when it comes to issues of plain tribes, Assamese mainstream society will always maintain them at a periphery. But when it comes to against citizenship or against illegal immigration, quote unquote, then you will find them they're actually fighting and supporting the mainstream ethno-nationalistic narrative, right? So like with that ethno-nationalistic narrative and fighting back against it. So I think this is something that is very, very important to note, right? So I think, yeah, I'll stop here. I had a point, but I'll come back to make it. I just can't recollect it.
Kind of picking up from that, Angshuman, this is a question for you. Like that response from from civil society, or like even people who would otherwise have a position on recognizing people who are fleeing their countries as refugees, kind of goes silent when when this form of nationalism takes over, because speaking up against or speaking up in favor of refugees at times ends up becoming dangerous. Like in the case of Manipur, Bablu, who was seen as somebody who represented the cause of refugees, because he had a pro-refugee position, was subject to violence, and there was a gag order literally put on him right in 2023, right? So then my question now is that the reality is that there is a war happening in Myanmar, right? There is a proper war that's going on in Burma from 2021. And India is largely, when I say India, most people in India, including journalists, including civil society, is largely unaware of what's happening in Burma. And why is it that so many people are trying to seek refuge in our borderlands? So, Angshuman, can you speak a little bit about that? Because you've been writing so much about Myanmar, you're also engaging with what's happening there. Can you speak a little bit about that? And then kind of, help us understand why is it that India, that wants to build different projects through Burma, use Burma as a transit country, cannot just turn away from its people who are facing, who are probably facing persecution? Like, isn't that like clear double standards? Like, so can you kind of speak a little bit about what's happening there, and also kind of how is it that the language in Manipur is kind of detrimental to what Manipur was previously doing, which was inviting traders from Burma to come here and, sort of build like trade relationships. That is something that they were doing up until the coup started. So maybe you can, kind of bring both of these things together and speak a little to that.
Yeah, it's a twofold question. In terms of the first part, I think one extraordinary thing that has happened is that, especially with respect to Manipur, because of Manipur, by Manipur, I mean the conflict in Manipur, is that the word refugee has transformed into a pejorative. It's become a catch-all slur word almost. In reality, the word refugee is rooted in humanitarianism, in a recognition of a person, of an individual needing of active humanitarian assistance who's fleeing a situation of extreme persecution or violence. But that entire context, that definitional context, has been completely lost in Manipur's context. So the word refugee is being seen in the same spirit as the term infiltrator or invader, something to that tune.
It's a bad word, basically.
It's a bad word. And an illegal immigrant, which was supposed to be, very strictly speaking, a legal term, has also become a bad word, a slur. Was probably worse than refugees. And as far as illegal immigrants is concerned, I think that term, the pejorative origins of that term are to do with a longer history of legislative changes that have happened in India's citizenship law, including the 2003 Citizenship Amendment Act, which inserted this provision that a person cannot be an Indian citizen if one of the parent is an illegal immigrant. So for the first time, this term illegal immigrant entered the lexicon of citizenship law under the Vajpayee government in 2003. And since then, this term has been, political parties and different civil society groups have used, played fast and loose with this term to use it everywhere against everyone and all kinds of, others, right? What is also, I'll come to the refugee thing. What is also interesting in the Assam case was that in the 60s and 70s, we saw a word, the most common word that was used for quote unquote illegal immigrants or undocumented migrants was called bahiragata, or outsider, right? Someone who comes from outside. When the Assam movement began in 1979 until 85, somewhere that word became bidehi, which is foreigner, which is more of a legal term, which has to do with citizenship rather than social belonging. By outsider, they meant more in a social territorial sense. But bidehi took on a legal sort of connotation, or foreigner who's not an Indian by law in that sense. So, that transformation captures a lot of the story of institutionalized xenophobia or political legal xenophobia. But in Manipur's context, as I said, I've never seen the word refugee being weaponized so much, even in Assam's context, as I've seen in Manipur. And like you said, prominent journalists, political figures are being tarnished using the word refugee. I don't think, Mono, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think the word refugee has been weaponized to that extent, even in Assam's case. In Assam's case, there are other words that are used. Illegal immigrants, bidehi, this Bangladeshi, of course, Mia, of course. But in Manipur, I think the word refugee has taken a hit in that sense. So this entire context that refugees, people who are coming from Myanmar, are not coming because they want to come to Manipur, but because they are coming out of extreme compulsion. And hence they're refugees, not just refugees, war refugees. I think the mainstream media has completely lost that background. Most certainly the Imphal-based, Imphal-centric Meitei media, who have completely turned that context on its head. So the fact that the Myanmar military is conducting airstrikes almost every week in Zagaing region, which is right next to India, and people have to flee because of that, is something that you barely get to read in reports about refugees, news reports about refugees. And it's mind-blowing how so many, as I said, so many of the news coverage on the refugees completely omit that context of why they're fleeing and what's happening in Myanmar. Ideally, they should open the report with that, because refugees are refugees because of a certain reason, and that reason should take center stage in that particular reportage. But it doesn't seem to happen. Secondly, I think you're right. There's a big contradiction in India's foreign policy towards Myanmar, which is we are singing two different tunes. One tune is extremely hostile, xenophobic, ethnically motivated, and at one point just perverse, right? And the other tune is one that talks about building people-to-people linkages, opening up borders, building seamless economic corridors, west-east economic corridors from India to Southeast Asia via Myanmar, right? And trust me, this paradox is being noticed. This contradiction is being noticed by people in Myanmar and further east in the Southeast Asian countries. that at one side you can't talk about activist policy, and on the other side, vehemently otherize refugees and talk about building a fence along the India-Myanmar border, right? This fork tongue policy, I feel probably India believes that it can manage it at some level, diplomatic level, but there are people, sensible people, and people who are watching India closely, including the democratic political class in Myanmar, who will most likely, if not today, if not tomorrow, if not next year, will come to power at some point. They are also taking note of this contradictory stance that India is taking. So I feel in the medium to long term, this will come to pass, and this contradiction will basically backfire for India's own strategic and political interests. Not least because of this extremely hostile anti-Myanmar narrative that has emerged from Imphal, specifically Imphal. So yeah.
Manu, can you tell me at least, because I'm very interested to know, how is India perceived? Angshuman, you can also add after he does. How is India perceived when people, other than the fact that certain neighbors have no other option than to look towards India for certain reasons, but how is India globally perceived as being, when it comes to, extending help to its neighbors? I mean, this is something that I want both of you all to kind of answer, because, you all are definitely understand this better than me, considering I am very, very rooted. I'm a ground reporter. I don't really understand what they're saying outside of India so much, but maybe you all can little bit help us understand. Is India perceived as being friendly to its neighbors or its refugees, or does globally also India have this thing that they are contradictory, like in the case of Burma, or also just selfish? One of you can take it. This is a question that I really wanted to ask, because I really want to know how we are perceived outside.
Yeah, you'll get us into trouble. But I think yes, I think it depends on who you ask from, right? And I think it's a large number of answers will differ. Like, for instance, if you're asking to a nation in terms of who has some economic interest ties to it, and then there are things like age-old relations, then probably they will be taking a very moderate tone. If you are asking a nation which is not basically particularly friendly and does not have a lot of economic ties, they will probably have a very a tone of kind of defining India as a power that suppresses. Like, for instance, and it also depends on even in South Asia as a neighbor, right? Like, you will see that there are, and this is not very recent, but it has come up, but the intensity has increased. I think, as somebody who has worked in South Asia, you will see in Nepal, there's vehement anti-India sentiment building up, right? And which you will see in Bangladesh, that happens. In Sri Lanka, you feel that happens. And essentially, they see India as at least in South Asia, as a big brotherly attitude, which tries to intervene in every internal matter, which India itself has not allowed others to intervene so much. So I think that's there. I think globally it is contradictory. As far as I understand, it's also seen as a sovereign nation who has always stood its ground and tried to play, at least externally, in terms of what benefits India, and has always put India first and tried to understand, and has not allied with superpowers just for the sake of it, right? So I think it has been very clear in that sense. But obviously, I would say there are particularly they also realize that India take positions when it benefits them, and what kind of benefits. But I think globally, I would still say that there's a mix of feeling about India's stance on certain things, right? I just wanted to also bring back this discussion. I know this is off topic. Like, for instance, when the question is when refugees is also understand only from a humanitarian perspective, when you don't have law or you don't have conventions building countries accountable. Like, for instance, in the case of Mizoram, let's say, right? You have values, you have age-old ties, which Angshuman has already mentioned. So you start doing it because you feel that, they are a charity case. We have to help them. They are our brothers. We have age-old relations, brothers and sisters. We have age-old relations. But as soon as the refugees starts to demand, not necessarily demand, but wants to live their life, start working, because they do want to go back, but they have no other choice but to work. And to survive, you have to have work, whatever work you get, sometimes it's lower the wages, sometimes you have to sell stuff in lower prices, then you start like the same feeling of brotherly, like it's like a or sisterly feeling towards your neighbor, suddenly start feeling more like, okay, you are creating problem for us, because of you these things are happening and you have to can now get out. So when this is the problem with humanitarian perspective, not necessarily in the sense of like excluding rights perspective, but in the sense if it doesn't include rights, it happens like that, right? Because you're not defined by collective liberation. You're not like, okay, this is a regime of repression going on and we have to collectively liberate each other. But you are morally defined by like, we have to help this poor soul, or we have to like, so as long as a refugee or an quote unquote illegal immigrant keeps their heads low and eyes down and just live on along with the secondary citizenship or secondary existence that is allowed by the state, then they are fine. But as long as they want to live like a decent human, which everybody would like to, then it becomes a problem. So I think that's something that I wanted to bring back. Yeah, but in terms of India, I this is what my feeling is until now, but I think Angshuman can say more.
No, the reason why I asked the previous question, and I'm glad you brought this because maybe we would have lost it in the flow of the conversation. But I think in the case of India or whichever states also want to provide facilities, it just stops with providing them like I don't know, like a sheet, like a little bit of food, and no clean drinking water. That is beyond the question. But it just stops there. There's no health facilities. Forget about them wanting to make an income. Like if the authorities are to be asked what it is that they have, because I saw this in Kamjong, the situation of the refugees there is so bad. It's so bad the way that they're living. And I mean, to kind of think that what's happening in Mizoram can happen in Manipur, where, some of them are also working and all, is out of question. But even that facility, that basic, like 1,500 people cramped into like such a small area and so many communicable diseases going around and no kind of help. I feel like they think they're doing a little too much, even when they kind of say that, we are doing all of this, that's the kind of attitude. So but the reason why I brought up this thing of how India is perceived is because like India makes certain statements, like when it made this statement in Quad, it's a part of Quad, right? It said that, we are trying to facilitate whatever help we can for people fleeing from Myanmar. This is something that the External Affairs Minister seems to be, at least he seems to suggest that India is thinking in that direction. But the reason why I bring this up is, where is the accountability which, bigger countries who we do trade with or who kind of we are in certain arrangements with, where is the accountability that they would bring if India is really abusing the way in which it's treating its refugees, or its absolute, failure to have a policy towards refugees, even while having so many refugees? I mean, shouldn't there be? I don't know. I mean, I know these things don't work in the way that we think it should, right? There should be accountability that other countries should have towards another country. But then we live predominantly in a space where the only accountability that comes is, okay, we are trading this way and this is what we expect from you when we are trading this way, right? So in that context, I asked, how is India perceived? And I think, Angshuman, you can comment on that. Like, most countries do not seem to question India on its double standards towards refugees, or also how it treats its refugees. And we treat our refugees, while we use Rohingyas and we weaponize Rohingya identity for all the reasons that, that the Hindutva project would use to weaponize that identity. Rohingyas are being abused in many southern and many cities in India, where they're being used for the kinds of labor that, mostly only oppressed caste people do in India. Like there was this report in Bangalore where Rohingyas were being used for doing scavenging, manual scavenging, and different kinds of things. So it's not like, and a lot of these contracts, the state is subcontracting. So it's not like the state is unaware. So while political parties have used this identity to kind of weaponize them as an outsider, their labor is also being used and they're not even being paid for it. They're living in horrible conditions. So when this kind of a double standard sort of a, policy India has, how is that nobody questions India on this?
Right. That's an interesting question. But Greeshma, can I ask you, do you have certain countries, specific countries in mind when you say, why does no one question it?
Like in Quad, right? In Quad, like for instance, Japan. just as an example, Japan seems to really wants to invest in, like there have been different conversations that Japan seems to have had in the Northeast as well. It really has different kinds of interests in developing this and that. Now, I'm not saying that Japan will question or not, because geopolitically they want to be relevant in that region. But I'm just saying, why is there such a lack of process internationally also to have these kind of standards?
So on the refugee issue, there is a serious lack of accountability worldwide. That is because most of these trading partners that India has, if you talk about the Quad, which is Japan, US, Australia, and India, all the three countries, for them, the refugee issue or how India treats refugees is an extremely low stakes issue.
I know the reason why I didn't even bring up USA and Australia is because US has a horrible refugee policy. So does Australia.
Exactly.
But I maybe Japan. But yeah.
No, I mean, if you see Japan's refugee policy, it's no good either. They're extremely averse to having an open door refugee policy too. So the point here is that none of these countries themselves have a local stand-by to to push the buttons on the refugee issue because of their own treatment of refugees. And but when I say US, let's forget about Trump. Let's talk about Biden, right? Biden's refugee policy, I would say, was significantly better than what we are seeing right now. There were serious issues with it, but at least it allowed certain third country resettlements of the Rohingyas, Afghan Muslims, etc., which have been completely blocked at the moment or suspended at the moment. But even under Biden, the priority was to trade with India, to tap into India's growing market, and more importantly, to ensure that India becomes a bulwark against China, right? That was the number one goal in Washington, D.C. Everything else came after that, right? For the White House, it was the White House was clear on that we are not going to lecture India on what it does on its certain internal issues. The only entity within the U.S. administration that used to do this was the USCIRF, which was a bipartisan Congress body, the Religious Commission on International Religious Freedom, which in its subsequent reports was very harsh on how India treats its minorities, including, I remember the report that came out after the Delhi riots of 2020. But even in those reports, the refugee issues were only mentioned marginally. So my best guess is it's a kind of, it's a case of you point one finger at someone else, three fingers are pointing towards you. So no one wants to take that ethical normative stance of lecturing another country, least of all a strategic partner, an economic partner like India, on an issue where they might themselves be implicated. And as I said, refugees, even look at how Europe has been treating refugees in the last 10 years. Even with all its open door liberal policies, EU is almost breaking up over the refugee issue, with basic norms of different countries and member states failing to agree on basic norms of how many refugees to welcome, how long they should stay. So even the Euro-American liberal sort of or transatlantic kind of liberal community of nations, I don't think they're clear on the refugee issue. They don't have any consensus on what a good refugee policy looks like. So I think the lack of accountability also comes from this fracturing that we have seen in the last 10, 15 years on particularly immigration and refugees. What is the other part of the question?
No, I think that sort of answers my thing about accountability, right? But while speaking about...
I wanted to briefly comment on your first question, which was India, how India is perceived in the region. In the last, I would say in the last 10 years, how India is viewed in South Asia and Southeast Asia has taken a hit, I would say. And there are several reasons behind this, but some specific incidents that come to my mind was India's 2015 blockade with Nepal. The kind of damage it did to India's image in Nepalese civil society is probably underwritten. Not written enough about. In Sri Lanka, I think Sri Lanka is one of those countries where India still fairly manages to have a sort of good image. And the recent bilateral deal that India signed with the Disanayaka government also shows that India does have that kind of access in Colombo. The other country that where India was able to maintain its foothold is also gone now, which is Bangladesh. And the kind of discontent and even anger that you will feel while talking to Bangladeshi civil society against India is just extraordinary. The kind of suspicion they have against India, it's something of a redux of the 60s and 70s. Actually, the 70s and 80s in that sense. So I would say India's public image, despite all the groundwork that it does in terms of its economic development and projects, India's general public image has suffered in the region. I don't think there's any other way to put it. And a lot of the blame, trust me, goes to the Indian media, right? The fact that Indian media has become kind of the regional nucleus of misinformation is something that all countries in the regions, scholars, journalists, analysts from Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Myanmar, Bhutan will clearly acknowledge to you, if not in public, but behind closed doors. And it is incumbent on the Indian government to actually put a stop to this. Look at the amount of disinformation that came out on Bangladesh from the Indian media after the events last year, right? And Bangladeshi journalists who actually had good faith relationships with India were very disturbed that why is this happening? Why isn't the government stopping this? And even today, you will see news reports which are completely based on like hearsay or intelligence sources talking about how the Yunus administration is a source of regional instability, etc. And half of it is conspiratorial, completely conspiratorial. In general, in Southeast Asia also, I think the general image about India is that India promises a lot in terms of development, but delivers very little, which is the exact opposite of China, right? China promises and delivers, right? And it is because that China has been able to capture that developmental space of bilateral cooperation that I think India's image has lost out even further. But one thing that India does well, which I think even China struggles to do, is HADR, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, right? Like after the Myanmar earthquake, the Indian team landed up pretty promptly. They were the first ones to get access to some of the hotspots that even the Chinese teams couldn't, in Sagaing and Mandalay. So I think that did a lot of, that I felt based on my conversations with a lot of people from Myanmar that that kind of repaired some of the public diplomacy damage
control.
Yeah, that had happened. But at the same time, the news about deportations of Myanmar refugees from Manipur, the news about India deciding to fence the India-Myanmar border and withdraw the free movement regime went around in Myanmar circles like wildfire, and they were very, very concerned about this. So I would say it's a mix of both, but generally trend-wise, I think India's image in the neighborhood has, as I said, taken a hit in the last few years.
So circling back to Manipur, since you spoke about how the media spread so much disinformation also about our neighbors, I mean, Manipur conflict itself, one of the bigger reasons why this thing blew up is also disinformation, right? Different forms of disinformation, and a major chunk connected with refugees, connected with how a few people on the border who were there living in pitiable conditions, horrible conditions, were kind of weaponized over a couple of years to create this whole sentiment against this community. And that kind of brings me back to the last question that I'm going to ask about the region. So, how it is that refugees were spoken about in Manipur, how it is that, how it is that a certain kind of hate was used and is still being used. I mean, as soon as Biren resigned, the only thing that he's been putting up since is this thing about illegal immigrants, right? And how he has been sort of the only tweets that he has been predominantly putting out is that how his whole exercise against illegal immigrants is what he will be at. He'll stay at it, irrespective of whether he's there in power or not. So he's not giving up. So, even the narrative on the ground doesn't seem to shift at all. But my final question to you, Mano, would be that when this form of churning started happening in Manipur about, where they started speaking this language, and then the violence started, and then they continued to speak in this language of, that this community is completely illegal, this community is not from here. There was not so much of a conversation or so much of support coming out from the neighboring states in the Northeast, like Mizoram spoke. Mizoram kind of took a position even when it came to when it comes to refugees, and they said that don't use this kind of language. But largely, and one reason why they always say Mizoram did it is because they also have similar ethnic ties, no? But this sort of, other than them, there wasn't a lot of conversation, or there weren't a lot of people other than maybe some of you who were disputing this narrative, who are kind of saying that no, this is wrong, or that what's this sort of thing fueling this whole violence in Manipur is wrong. So the region also sort of failed to, address conversations around this. Why do you think that is? And, your comment on this?
Yeah, I would say, like, for instance, there could be multiple reasons for it, right? But I think holistically, and Angshuman can correct me if I'm wrong, but Northeast or the states in Northeast historically has not been very, very comfortable with presence of, let's say, refugees or quote unquote illegal immigrants, right? There has been anxieties, and that those anxieties have come out in different forms. So, and then the solidarity as such, like, for instance, this makes me questions, and I have been asked this question multiple times even, like, for instance, does there an identity called tribal solidarity or a Northeast solidarity? Does it exist? Probably it's very difficult to find. So you will not find, because the anxieties and the narrative that is created becomes like outsider versus insider, which has a lot of acceptance in the region already. So you will not find a lot of people speaking up against it, because it is something that they think that, okay, these are the creations. So because that the narrative has gotten a lot of foothold already, right? For instance, there are even words like pest used, like parasites used for outsiders, to define outsiders. So once you end up the process of being able to create another, you will not find a lot many people speaking up against or speaking in solidarity for the others. And so this solidarity act probably doesn't exist. Second is, like, I think a lot of it also comes from, like, for instance, unclarity of understanding. Many people actually don't know what is going on. So they just believe whatever is put out in media vehemently and consistently throughout media channels and narratives. And we know how many of the media channels work, like including the regional media, right? How it works, and especially those from Assam, which will keep fostering and repeating out from the mic. And third is, I would also think that probably it also depends, like, it would probably be naive to expect a state response, like, for instance, because if you are not a separate government, but you are the same ally ruling, and then you're ruling the Northeast as a region, and then you would not find a Himanta coming up and speaking for, or probably even Sangma coming and speaking, because they are allies. So I think there are a lot of these conditionalities attached to it. So which means that you will not find people consistently and speaking it. So it has also, like, for instance, Angshuman and I and many of us have, like, this, because it takes a lot of like I would say courage and simply the belief in justice and the belief in the other person as a human to also stand up and speak, right? So once you have denigrated someone into a secondary status, it becomes very, very difficult for them to speak for. And so it's like only a few will find and stand and then continuously do so, irrespective of what the situation is, and then take the positions of the marginalized. So that doesn't generally happen. So that's, to me, I think those are a couple of things that you will find it. So it is not natural. It will not come natural. It's a lot of conscious critical engagement that has to be done. Otherwise, that kind of solidarity will never appear to be natural. And we have seen many, like, so-called progressive journalists taking sides of the majoritarians in their reporting, right? So we have consistently talked about it, even if in mainstream media. So it's not like they are doing because they don't understand it. Even then, they understand it because they continuously do it because it's a conscious choice. So I think there are these things that needs to happen. Yeah, over to you, Ansh.
Yeah, thanks, Mano. I think you summed it up quite well. When I think about Northeast and refugees or immigrants, I always go back to this essay that Arjun Appadurai, the Indian American sociologist, wrote in 2006, which the title of the essay itself is so instructive, which is "Fear of Small Numbers." Right? This constant anxiety of the majority. That a small group of people, which in a demographic sense much more insignificant than them, would hinder the process of the majority hinder the majority's process of dominating politics and society. So it doesn't matter if we are talking about 200 or 300 refugees in a population of, let's say, 10 million or 15 million. Those 200 or 300 refugees would be kind of extrapolated and made into this larger than life monster, right, which is going to destabilize society. And we have seen this in the case of Assam. We are most certainly seeing this in the case of Manipur. And attached to this, is a commonality between Assam and Manipur and many other contexts, which is that the numbers are simply wild. Today they will say there are 5,000 refugees. Tomorrow they will say there are 5 crore refugees. And day after tomorrow they will say there are no refugees. Biren Singh himself, was it in 2018 or 19 in the India Today conclave, said there are no illegal immigrants in Manipur. And suddenly, he 2 years later, he says Manipur is inundated by illegal immigrants, right? We saw this. We have seen this is a game that has played out over and over again in the context of Assam over the last 30 years. And NRC, in Assam's case, was supposed to end this game of numbers by giving a conclusive figure. In reality, NRC only worsened that game, right? We now have a wild figure of 19 lakh, or 1.9 million, out of which probably most of them are not really illegal immigrants, but simply fail to prove their citizenship because of insufficient documentation or some small spelling mistake or whatever. And that's why Mano was also earlier talking about this application of the Assam model or the Assam NRC model on Manipur is also so dangerous, right? That NRC does not close the numbers debate. It makes it more. It stretches the debate. In fact, it makes it more precarious. In that sense, but what we have seen is that this alarmism that is created around very very small groups of people is a very very is an extremely common feature across Northeast India, and a lot of it has to do with as Mano was saying, anxieties over land, anxieties over identity, and when those anxieties are politically mobilized in a certain way, they become in many ways far more antagonistic than what they actually were. On the ground, these anxieties probably are rooted to genuine socio-economic concerns of retaining jobs, retaining cultural aspects that they think they will lose. But the moment they cross the threshold of society and politics, I think a monster emerges, which is this monster of violence and xenophobia, which manifests in extreme cases like the Delhi massacre, and what we are seeing in Manipur today, in many ways. So I think we were led to believe that in the last 2 decades, because of development, because of social and economic policies, of affirmative policies, of land protection, tribal protection, that we will see more inclusion. But last few years have shown that we are going in a completely different direction. The kind of hatred we are seeing against particular group of people being framed as outsiders or refugees is something that we probably didn't even see in earlier periods of history. So it is a worrying period, and it foreshadows an even more worrying future, I would say, for the entire Northeast.